All right, sports fans, how's everybody out there doing? William Martin coming at you one more time here on YouTube with another edition of the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge Podcast. Who knew that last January, when Penn State lost to Notre Dame in the Orange Bowl, that just 9 months later, that they'd be moving on from their head coach? After nearly 12 years in Happy Valley, Penn State has decided that it was time for them to move on from James Franklin, and that's why they fired him yesterday. Now, in nearly 12 years at Penn State, Franklin was 104 and 45, and only Joe Paterno won more games for the Nittany Lions as their head coach than Franklin did. Now, the what did it in? I mean, you just look at it. I mean, Penn State's recent three-game losing streak, which included losing to previously winless UCLA and then, of course, Northwestern this past Saturday. Both of those games, all right, we're talking about a Penn State squad that was favored by more than 20 points. And it was one of those where those two losses right there were basically the final nail in Franklin's coffin there. And honestly, the Penn State faithful had been getting fed up with Franklin for quite some time due to his inability to win the big games. Now, within the Big Ten, Franklin was 64 and 36, but you got to look inside of the numbers because a lot of those came against the also rans. What hurt Franklin the most was that he was 4 and 21 against top 10 teams while he was a head coach at Penn State, and he consistently struggled against the likes of Michigan and Ohio State. And honestly, that's what ultimately did him in. I'll tell you like this, a couple of weeks ago, Penn State was ranked in the top five. They welcomed Oregon to Happy Valley. They lost a close game. Oregon, of course, being a top five team at the time. The Fire Franklin chant started. But if Penn State had beaten UCLA and if Penn State had beaten Northwestern, we're not having this conversation now because you're then talking about a 5-1 Penn State team who still can't, has a head coach who still can't win the big game. But you're like, you know what? Maybe they make another run at the college football playoff, and you got to wait and see. But of course, all of that is out of the window right now. So, whereas the big games for James Franklin were not his forte, okay, I still think when people look back on his time at Penn State, they should, and they're not going to do it, of course, initially because, you know, the wound is still fresh. But nonetheless, they should look back on a guy um, who gave this program stability after the scandal that ended Joe Paterno's time there, and then of course the quick departure by Bill O'Brien. Of course, Bill O'Brien took over. It was a situation where, of course, Penn State was on a 4-year bowl ban. They got it reduced to two by the time that Franklin took over in 2014. And, by his third year, he had gotten the Nittany Lions to an 11-3 mark, and they won the Big Ten. And he was a guy that, with the exception of the 2020 COVID year, he never had a losing season there. You're talking about a guy who had 4 11 win seasons, and of course, last year 13 win season, more wins than any head coach for a season in Penn State history. And it's one of those, I think those are the things that he should uh, be remembered for because you look at where Penn State was after, the Joe Paterno scandal or the scandal that just simply rocked that organization. Bill O'Brien tried to keep things afloat, and then where Franklin got them to. This was a team that consistently finished in the top 15 ranking wise. They were consistently a top 20 team to begin the year. Matter of fact, they began this season ranked number two in the nation, which is why the expectations were so high. And I think at the end of the day, when it's all said and done, that is what people should look back on. Now, you look at it, Franklin sent his fair share of talent to the NFL from Penn State. You just think of the likes of names such as Saquon Barkley, Tyler Warren and Micah Parsons, just to name a few. Aside from winning the big games or being unable to win the big games, I've talked about this before. What really hurt James Franklin, he failed to get those impact quarterbacks and those impact wide receivers, those game changing guys. You see how Ohio State, for an example, another Big Ten school, they're consistently sending wide receivers to the NFL, first round picks. Their quarterbacks are getting drafted. That's something that Penn State has been unable to do under Franklin. Yeah, his quarterbacks get drafted, but they're late round picks and they're never really like the impact guys in the NFL. And I think the biggest thing with Franklin so much on offense, he relied on his system. And his system was good enough to beat the also rans in the Big Ten. But when you're going to take that next step up and be able to beat those elite teams, you need those impact players. And that's something that hurt him. Also, you brought in former Ohio State defensive coordinator Jim Knowles this year. And this was Jim Knowles who coached up that championship defense for the Buckeyes last year as they won the national championship. And you look at things, and it was just like this Penn State defense, their last three games, they have not been the same. They gave up 30 points to Oregon. Then, of course, 42 to UCLA, albeit UCLA looks like a different team now since they moved on from Deshaun Foster. And then, of course, losing yesterday to Northwestern. It's one of those where Penn State, they are willing to pay nearly $50 million to James Franklin to have him walk away, and of course they're going to have to go out there and shell out big bucks for their next head coach. I can totally see Penn State going for a big name after this because they want a name that is going to galvanize their fan base. It's going to make the boosters and alumni sit up in their chairs and like, hey, you know what? We've got our guy. And also they want somebody who's going to allow them to keep up with the Joneses in the Big Ten Conference. I think some names to keep an eye out for, and I could be wrong here, but I think these are just some names to keep an eye on, in my opinion. I think Fran Brown at Syracuse and his year plus there, he's turned things around there. He's building a culture. And he could be somebody on Penn State's radar. Curt Cignetti at Indiana. Yes, Indiana is a Big Ten school. We've seen what Curt Cignetti has done there in the year plus. But I simply don't see Curt Cignetti staying in Indiana long term because one of these bigger football programs is going to scoop him up. Maybe it's Penn State. A name that I think people should pay attention to is Marcus Freeman. I'm not saying that Marcus Freeman is going to leave Notre Dame, but the thing is, I think if Penn State made him an offer that he could not refuse, maybe he leaves. Marcus Freeman is sitting pretty right now. Notre Dame is sitting pretty right now. Marcus Freeman has really established his program at South Bend. Notre Dame, like I said before, they made the championship game last year. They don't have to share that money with a conference, like a Big Ten school would have to. Okay. Notre Dame has more money to pay Marcus Freeman right now. So maybe he doesn't leave. We don't know. And another guy I think people should keep an eye out for is Mike Elko. Mike Elko, he's really got himself established right now at Texas A&M. Prior to that, he was at Duke. But Mike Elko is a Northeast guy. He's from Jersey. Okay. He played his college football at Penn. All right. And maybe Penn State makes him an offer that he cannot refuse. But nonetheless, they've got to get a guy, like I said, who's going to galvanize the fan base and the alumni, and he's going to be able to recruit. Don't get me wrong, James Franklin recruited, okay, and he recruited solid players, had a consistent pipeline to the NFL. But like I said, it's just the quarterback and wide receiver position. I feel like he consistently came up short against. To me, I feel like the last Penn State wide receivers that they really had that made impacts like that went on to the NFL, maybe a Jahan Dotson or, of course, a Chris Godwin with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But with this Penn State job now open, I guarantee you that there are going to be several big name coaches who are about to cash in. Why? Because they're going to get extensions because their respective schools are going to be fearful about them talking to and potentially leaving for Penn State. But nonetheless, this Penn State job is going to trigger a lot of other moves, and there's a lot of big names programs that are going to be looking and currently are looking for head coaches this offseason. But nonetheless, I think this is the one, the creme de la creme, if you will, that is really going to trigger things. So for Penn State, they've got to let the dust settle right now. They're 0-3 in the Big Ten, and they, along with Michigan State, Rutgers, Purdue, and Wisconsin, are the only programs who have not won a game within the conference so far this year. Very surprising. I think Penn State wants to try to salvage this season. I think, at this point, they've thrown in the towel as far as trying to get to the college football playoff and be a contender in the Big Ten. And I think they are already laying the groundwork for 2026, which is why they decided to do this right now. It's one of those, again, James Franklin won at Penn State. James Franklin had a solid program, but ultimately, your inability to win those big games is going to catch up with you, because if you can't win the big games, you still have to you at the very least have to go out there and win the games against the teams that you're supposed to beat. And I think in the last couple of weeks, that was Franklin's undoing. I truly do think, and I said this before, I feel like James Franklin is this generation's version of John Cooper. Of course, the former Ohio State head coach. John Cooper, phenomenal head coach throughout the decade of the 90s at Ohio State. But of course, his undoing there was his inability to beat Michigan. James Franklin's inability, his undoing, his inability to beat both Michigan and Ohio State, and then of course, ultimately, overall, the top teams in the nation. So I think Penn State, they're going to take some time. They're probably hard at work right now trying to see what their options are, and they're definitely going to try to court somebody. And it would not surprise me uh, within the next, probably by the end of this month, maybe early November, they definitely have their sights set on a guy or guys who they maybe want to be their next head coach. On the flip side, for James Franklin, I think at some point we will see him coach again. He doesn't have to rush into things right now. He's getting 50 million. Okay, so he could sit back and take a chill pill and spend some time with his family and chart his next move. There's going to be openings, and I guarantee you somebody's going to give James Franklin an opening. Maybe he goes to a smaller school where the spotlight isn't there as much, maybe where the pressure isn't there as much, and he can go in there and thrive there. But nonetheless, this was a shocker, but it wasn't a shocker. But whenever you have a situation where the fan base is turning on a coach, it's never good. And I think a lot of the sins, if you will, would have been able to have been forgiven if Penn State had won the last two games. Because had they have beaten UCLA and Northwestern, we're not having this conversation here. But nonetheless, ultimately, like I said before, James Franklin's inability to win the big game was his undoing. If you had asked me at the beginning of this college football season or if you had told me rather, that Penn State would be firing James Franklin here in the middle of October, I would have fallen out of my chair. Okay, but at the end of the day, it's a what have you done for me lately business. Like I said, James Franklin won, but he just didn't win the big games. And that was his undoing in Happy Valley. But folks, that is going to wrap it up. And as always, I want to take this time out to thank each and every one of you for checking out the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. And as always, if you like what you heard and saw in this podcast, you know what to do. Just hit that like button as well as subscribing to this channel. Like I always say, it's greatly appreciated. Also, if you are on the X, formerly known as Twitter, you can check me out anytime at 300 Pounds of Sports. And like I always say, if you follow me, it will be my pleasure to follow you right back. There's also the sports discussion group on Facebook at the Sports Depot 365, and you can check it out. Drop a line and be a part of one of the better sports debating sites going on social media, just like it is on the X. You can check me out anytime on Instagram at 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge. Give me that follow. I will do the same in return. But until next time, fine folks, my name is William Martin. I'm signing off, and I'm saying thanks once again for checking out the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. Be well, everybody.